Alrighty. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Amir Mer. I'd like to welcome you to Pivotal 180's webinar as an introduction to the grid, which will be the first part in a two-part series. Thank you for joining us. Just to the outset set out and lay out the agenda, I should say. We initially conceived this as a one-off webinar, but as we got into it, we realized there was more material that could be covered in one. So keep your eye out at the end of the session, or rather perhaps after, we'll send an email out that will outline when the next session will be and the contents therein. But we're pleased to join you and welcome each of you to the conversation here. And over the course of this webinar, what we're going to do is try to empower you with a series of frameworks that will help you understand how the grid works. Does anyone else let me know if you can hear me? I see my audio working, but sounds like I'm on mute for some of you. A couple of other notes in the chat. All good coming across? Okay, great. Apologies for those technical issues. I might need to turn up your volume, but sounds like I'm coming across clearly. In any case, you might be wondering why an organization that, for the most part, leads trainings on project finance tools, skill sets, modeling, and related activities might be providing a session on an introduction to the grid. And ultimately, in terms of those frameworks that we want to set you up with, how to think about pricing in the electric power context, part of what makes a good investor, a good lender, or a good developer, or anyone else in our space is having the intuition as formed via experience developed over time and application of one's skills in a variety of different contexts to know what the right questions are to ask, right? And that's a really long-winded way of saying you cannot be a good investor in the electric power space, whether that's in terms of building out power blocks for data centers, traditional power, and other related, services, as the case may be, without knowing how the grid works, and therefore what are the right questions to ask through those different lenses of investor, lender, developer, regulator, and so on and so forth. So with that, let's dive right in and start asking and posing some of those questions together and understanding the grid better. We're going to build our way towards high-level pricing, location-based marginal pricing, which I apologize in advance for all the jargon, but I'll do my best to distill it as we go along. So when we think about the grid and the function that it serves in terms of the service provision it provides to all its different customers, we have to constantly answer three separate questions. On the demand side, how much power is needed and how much power is needed instantaneously. Electricity is a bit of a unique commodity in the sense that you need to provide and meet that demand 100% in real time. If I turn my AC on, or if you turn your microwave on, and so on and so forth, right? I need that power instantaneously. So then what becomes really important is what are the resources available at that instant in time, more or less. There is increasingly electric storage in the form of batteries and other related technologies or solutions, but still, what resources can be instantaneously mobilized to deliver those services as the case may be? And then where is it needed? We oftentimes take for granted, right? And I'm going to continuously use an analogy herein that's going to focus in on comparing the electric power grid to water pipelines, right? We constantly focus on just the supply and demand side, but there are other constraints, right? I live in New York City, for example, where there are 8 million or so people and a lot of electric demand, but there aren't a lot of generators around us, even though we have enormous hydro resources up north near Niagara Falls, wind and solar resources, and other conventional power plants in the surroundings of the city. But all of that is going to be constrained by the transmission lines coming into this tight area, this enormous demand zone, which is New York City. So in terms of agenda, and then at the end, we're going to spare some time for Q&A. So please go right ahead and start populating the Q&A to the extent I'm going to make it available now with any questions you might have, and then we'll get it to at the end. The agenda is going to work through those different exercises by, in the first instance, introducing you to the grid, key actors and agents therein, how markets enter the picture and what function they serve and provide, as the case may be, supply, demand, and how those inform system-wide price formation, and then how transmission and congestion ultimately inform location-based pricing. The presentation is not going to be comprehensive. It's a 30,000 foot level framework rather than giving you the ability to calculate specific market prices in Zone J of the New York Independent System Operator territory, as the case may be. But it's the tools you'd need to go that deep, right, on a case-by-case basis. So ultimately, right, that's going to boil down to helping us answer the question of how markets are turning physical constraints, the physics of electricity, of power lines, of generation, of delivery, into financial signals that mobilize the resources we need to meet demand in real time in light of real world constraints. So to do that, let's start with the grid itself. And a lot of this may be review for some of you, or it may be new, as the case may be. But what the grid historically has done since the days of Thomas Edison, when the first coal power plant was built in southern Manhattan near Pearl Street, for those of you who are anywhere close to New York City, is generate power in one location and then transmit it to those demand centers. So what does that look like in practice? You have, power plants located where the resources are. A nuclear plant oftentimes is sited near water to cool the reactors if it's a water-based cooling system. Wind and solar obviously are sited to be near wind resources and, good high quality sun, but also accessibility to the grid to transmit that power elsewhere. Natural gas or coal-fired power plants, ideally you have them close to the grid, but also close to the sources of the fuel that goes in. But what's ultimately, from a system-wide perspective, the thing that connects and relates them all is they all generate electricity. And from the overarching grid's perspective, one key metric to pay mind to is they do so at relatively low voltages, 2.3 to 24 kilovolts or 1,000 volts, as the case may be. Now, I promise not to torture you with too much physics, but going back to that water analogy, right? Hopefully it's intuitive that if you want water to go more efficiently and quickly down the power line, you would apply pressure. Now that pressure can come from differences in water going from high locations to low locations, availing itself of gravity, or you could have compressors or other systems that actually force the water through, right? There's a parallel that's not a perfect analogy in the electricity world, which is voltage. Voltage is like the pressure system for electric power lines. And the long story short, without going into ohmic physics, is that the higher the voltage that we can use, the more efficiently with lower resistance and therefore lower losses that we can transmit that power over long distances. So despite the fact that there's some degree of heterogeneity in the voltage of the generation assets themselves, regardless of whether it's nuclear, geothermal, wind, solar, etc., what we invariably end up doing to efficiently transmit that power is go through a process whereby we use what's called a transformer to step up that voltage by approximately an order of magnitude, sometimes two, depending on the underlying generation's voltage, to efficiently apply that pressure, the voltage in this case, and transmit the power over very long distances, which is where transmission then comes in, right? In the classical utility grid model, and we're seeing deviations from this as microgrids and other new business models diffuse across the marketplace, right? But at least for now, much of how electricity is delivered is really not that different than how it was delivered when Edison was starting out his business, right? And so these overhead transmission lines over hundreds, if not thousands of miles, will take that electricity that's now been stepped up anywhere from 115 to 800 kilovolts and send it, halfway across the country as the case may be, or say, to continue with my New York analogy, you can generate power upstate near Niagara Falls by Buffalo and send it over transmission lines down to the demand center in New York City. When you get there, right, or get close, as the case may be, you'll have to step that power back down to a usable voltage that matches the voltage required by industrial processes, commercial businesses, and residential households. So you'll step down that power and then distribute it over local power lines until you get to your end users. And then you deliver that power ultimately, say, to residential homes at 0.12 or 0.2 kilovolts, which, for those of you who've read the back of any electrical device, corresponds to the 120 volts or 240 volts for which much of our electrical devices are rated. So this encompasses the physical grid in many respects. There's other actors and agents involved. But think of generation as your upstream activity, to draw the analogy to oil and gas. Upstream is where you extract the oil from the ground. Generation is where you generate that electricity. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but a good analogy. Transmission is your quote unquote midstream segment of the electrical supply chain. It takes generation or energy from point A and delivers it to point C, which is your distribution network, right? That goes that last mile to take that electricity that's centrally generated elsewhere, transmit it halfway across the state or the country or many countries, say if we're talking about the EU and its electric power network, the ENSO-E system, until you get to the distribution network where you then deliver it to residential, commercial, industrial, and other customers and end users. So here in the US and much of the rest of the developed power market worlds, those technical losses, right, why we step up that power are on the order of sort of 5 to 8%. In the US, I think the average is 6% from end to end, which means that for every 100 megawatt hours, a unit of energy that's being generated at the point of generation, about 96 megawatt hours are getting to the end user, which is remarkably efficient. And some marketplaces in less developed economies, those losses may be on the order of 50%. So you can imagine how inefficient that is because you need to generate twice as much power just to get it through the grid as needed at the end location. And someone's ultimately got to pay for that, right? But this is the physical makeup of our grid. Generation generates the electricity, transmission transmits it almost instantaneously. Electricity moves pretty quickly, not quite at the speed of light, but I think if memory serves 40,000 meters per second. And then distributed in the final sort of set of miles to the end users who are going to then consume that power. So as we think about the grid, right, and what makes electricity different, and I'm going to keep harping on this point, unlike most products, it needs to be produced and consumed almost instantly. So our power plants, imports from other regions, other countries, batteries that are discharging or, pumped hydro stations need to be able to provide that supply, those resources almost instantaneously, in some cases actually instantaneously, to meet the demand from homes, businesses, commercial businesses, factories, data centers increasingly, electric vehicles, and batteries that conversely to those discharging might be charging at any given time. These are the two economic legs of the grid, supply and demand. But they, as I said previously, are going to be constrained by things like geography, which in this instance includes congestion. Just as, how much water can go through a pipeline is constrained by the size of the pipeline and how much water can go through. The same, so too, is true of overhead power lines, although obviously nuanced and different in terms of how much electricity can be sent from point A to B. So sometimes you have to go from A through C to B, and that has an associated cost with it. So supply and demand, while they're ultimately going to set your system-wide price, your local, which is where we get the term in the jargon, location-based marginal price, is determined by localized characteristics, right? Things like congestion and other related costs that we aren't going to get to in great detail. The other facet, which is important to keep in mind, but we won't have the time to discuss in this specific session, is reliability. The system needs reserves and stability. Some of that is just in terms of maintaining the electrical operations beyond the scope of this webinar and tough to get into without a background in mechanical engineering or electrical engineering or physics. But some of it is just, reserves for the hottest day of the year. Sometimes what happens, is on the hottest or coldest days of the year, the electric demand is at the highest. You take or reduce one plant for whatever reason. It's maybe got scheduled maintenance, unscheduled maintenance offline, and you need to make sure that if suddenly everyone's turning their AC units on in the middle of the day across all these different businesses, you have enough power to meet that load in light of the unavailable plant. Reliability reserves, right? And a good rule of thumb is such that you need to have at least 15% excess capacity at any given time to meet, sudden peaks in demand, since you have to meet supply and demand instantaneously. We might go into reliability in the second session, but for now, I'm just going to park the conversation here and keep coming back to this point that the grid needs to deliver power at the right place at the right time. So it looks like we have a question on whether a recording will be available here in the chat. That one I can answer very swiftly. Yes, we will share the recording after the fact. So if folks can't participate, or we have folks from other geographies who need to join and listen and aren't averse to listening to my long-winded tirades, absolutely. Now, who keeps the grid running? Who are the key actors, right? We've already spoken about generators, transmission, and distributors. These may be entities that are separated or united together under a utility framework, and I'll come back to utilities in a section. But we also have grid operators and regulators. So I won't repeat what I said about generators, transmission, and distributors, but just note and give you a little bit of history that's important as you think about, especially in the US context, but also increasingly in the rest of the world. Historically, a natural monopoly was formed and a utility was granted the right to solely manage generation, transmit what it generated over long distances, and then deliver it to its ratepayers, its customers, whether they were residential, industrial, or commercial customers, as the case may be. About 30 years ago, during the first, the only George H.W. Bush administration and the Clinton administration here in the United States, what we saw was the disaggregation, especially of generation from that model, right? So sometimes distributors too, but the trend was a bunch of rules were passed that allowed the grid to disaggregate transmission and distribution from generation. And the thesis was, and I apologize for the heavy-handed explanation of monopolies, doesn't make sense to have multiple utilities, say, providing transmission and distribution services. And the easiest way to think about that is, yes, competition in general brings down costs, but it would be both really ugly in terms of our cityscapes, but also extremely cost inefficient and economically suboptimal to build 7 different overhead power lines going down a street or across different states to transmit the power to create competition, because you'd have to build 7 times as much infrastructure. So this is an asset class, and the same is true typically for most utilities, that's really well suited to a natural monopoly. Let's let one person build it out, and then we'll create a regulator who's going to set the market rules, approve market structures to ensure that that natural monopolist is not in a position to abuse that monopoly and take advantage of its ratepayers and overcharge them, as the case may be. When, however, and this is not the sole explanation, but a good way to think about it, they decided to disaggregate generation, the thesis being, well, they don't need to control all the generation. If the utility's building it all, they're going to hire all the contractors, and they may, just pick their friends who are the contractors, or, with the absence of, competition, they may build more expensive plants than they need to. If we can introduce competition on this side, that should translate to lower costs to the ultimate rate player, right? Because competition is generally a good thing. And the same paradigm that applies to transmission and distribution, where having multiple power lines doesn't make sense, is not true on the generation side. Now, what problem or opportunity or challenge, depending on your perspective, does that create when we deregulate it in terms of thinking about our modern grid? Well, what it meant is now you had generators that weren't just serving one utility service territory. So if we're talking about the Consolidated Edison again here in New York, if you built a power plant north of the city, you might want to both sell electricity to Con Ed and its transmission and distribution network, but maybe also to utilities in New Jersey or in Connecticut, as the case may be. So what ended up happening is, whilst the regulator setting the rules and much of the physical activities of the grid, if you can follow my mouse cursor here, are being managed by the generators, transmission, and distributors, whether a part of a utility or separately in the form of an independent power producer or a developer or a distributor, right, a retail distributor of electricity, is you needed some sort of overarching, and these are often not-for-profits, independent system operators to ensure that communications interface between all these different parties, not across just one utility service territory, but across utilities, right, in a larger region such as New York State or PJIM, and we'll get to examples of these independent system others, coordinating in such a way that you're managing supply, demand, and reliability, both to ensure that high quality power in the right quantity is getting everywhere it needs to, but also in a fashion that is mobilizing resources in the lowest cost way possible. So there are other players in the electricity space. This is a gross oversimplification, but these are the big 30,000-foot largest actors who are shaping market activities. So then you might ask, well, what role the market play and how do they enter into this picture? And they're providing the coordinating function for the system, and in very oversimplifying fashion, a couple of key services, namely one, dispatch, which is industry jargon for deciding which resources should run and when to meet the needs of the grid, right? The second piece therein is pricing. How should these resources be compensated for the services they're delivering, whether that be just power because the grid needs it, people on the demand side need that electricity, or more esoteric, what are called ancillary services like frequency regulation or voltage control to ensure the quality of that power is sufficient across the grid so that we don't have blackouts, brownouts, or other perverse outcomes. Power markets also manage things like congestion. If there's too much power going across lines A to B, but we have other connections from A to C or A to D to B, right? How do we manage that limited overhead transmission lines and ensure that power is getting to the right place in a fashion that's not damaging the grid, but also ensuring that supply and demand once again is met in real time? And then I keep coming back to this, but the power markets are also ensuring and compensating service providers, resource providers for the reliability related services that are oftentimes like insurance like products for the grid that we need, in the absence of which we would have more often brownouts, blackouts when we run into high demand events or low supply events or some combination thereof. So in the second webinar, we'll go far deeper on the specific types of markets and the services they provide and how they operate. But in broad strokes, markets are solving problems across some subset, either an individual one of these or some subset or combination of all of the above, depending on the specific market, the rules as the case may be. And so ultimately, markets are taking these grid needs, these physical grid needs and constraints, and translating them into operational and financial decisions. And in the second part of the webinar series, we'll see how we can take those and factor those into our investment decision making. But in this first one, we're going to build the framework and ability to understand how to do that by, in the first instance, looking at price formation at the system-wide level. So I'm going to start with some jargon. I'm going to apologize in advance, but hopefully demystify it as we go along. The marginal power plant is the one that often sets the price. Not always, which is why the often qualifier is provided here. But think of the marginal power plant as the last one you need to instruct to run to make sure that supply is sufficient to meet the instantaneous demand. So imagine, and this is based on an actual daily plot of electricity power prices in California's independent system operator territory. You have a chart here, or rather a graph that shows on the y-axis price in dollars per megawatt hour. And on the x-axis, you have time over the course of a full 24-hour day from midnight one day to the next. I'm just going to describe what's going on to help contextualize it and build your intuition as to why it's doing what it's doing. And then we'll look at some specific points in time to start building our knowledge of how supply and demand are ultimately going to conspire together to create a situation in which we can figure out what the system-wide price can be at any given time. Now, imagine here, right? It's the middle of the night. There are some base power load needs. Hospitals need to run at all time. For some reason, Times Square, the lights have to be on at all times at maximum brightness, whether anyone's there to see the advertisements or not. You know, there's some combination of fridge motors are on or off at any given time. You know, they turn on for a few hours, turn off, and so on, right? There's a base amount of power that over the night is needed for our electric grid to operate. And because there's not a ton of volatility, which means changes in demand up or down over the night, you see pretty stable prices because the resources can be dispatched, called to provide the electricity needed at a pretty stable level over the course of the night. As people wake up, the demand increases, right? And as does the price, because you're mobilizing additional resources to meet the incremental need. The marginal power plant is being instructed to turn on, and then the next one, and then the next one. And here in this California case, just to show you a very specific example to make the point, right? Imagine a lot of solar is on the grid. It's a sunny summer day, and as the solar comes online and it gets sunnier, the electricity that's being generated mostly for free, the sun shines for free, right, is pushing that price down such that it even goes negative. And as the sun starts to set, you see that that effect from the solar go away, the negative prices turn back positive, you work your way back up, right? And then at night, people are turning their ACs on at home. Some of the office ACs may be on as well. But you see the same dynamic until you get late into the night, and so on and so forth, rinse and repeat, right? So let's take an instant in time. I guess this must be about 10:15. Don't hold it against me that I didn't get the exact hour right. You can see that at this point, you might have low demand relative to the energy resources being generated by the system. So you have a low price, about $10 per megawatt hour at this instant in time. Because yes, maybe people are turning on a lot of their electric systems, but the sun is shining for free, and a lot of that solar is producing really cheap electricity. Now, as the sun sets on the other side, right, you still have really high demand, but the resources available now, those really cheap solar resources have gone away. The sun set, maybe there's cloud coverage, maybe some combination of all the above. Well, there's definitely the sun is setting because it's now 7 o'clock in most instances, right? And so you need to activate more and more power plants until you get to this peak demand point, in particular, when you are calling on the most expensive, the scarcest power plant that you need to meet the immediate demand for that night. But the point is, if you need to and want to understand what the power price should be at that instant in time, take a graph like this, right? And figure out what the marginal power plant is doing here and back solve here for what the associated price is, right? If the price is varying here, right, we're seeing the result of where supply meets demand. if the supply is such, right, that the cheapest electricity is now no longer available and we're having to activate peaker or intermediate load power plants to meet our need, you can see that that power plant has a price, a minimum price that corresponds to, say, 35 bucks a megawatt hour here. Now, yeah, I'm going to explain how this graph comes together by breaking it down into its constituent supply and demand parts first. So please bear with me as I do so. But a good framework for figuring out what the net price is going to be, and this is a simplification, is to get our location-based marginal price, which is what we're going to get to by the end of the specific webinar, is adding the generation marginal cost. What's the cost? The system-wide cost of running the next plant, plus transmission and congestion related costs, plus marginal losses. We won't talk about marginal losses. They're important, but difficult to break down in a short webinar. But we're going to start here with generation marginal cost and then go into transmission marginal cost so we can back solve for what the location-based marginal price needs to be at any instant in time. So I'm going to show you something similar to that for the graph, but this is now a demand curve. It's based on an actual load profile for California on a given day many years ago. And you can see on the y-axis, you have your demand in the California Independent System Operated Territory. And on the x-axis, once again, you have the 24 hours in the day. And the same paradigm applies here. People are going to sleep. In the middle of the night, you have a certain amount of base load power. And then as folks wake up and turn on their devices, that demand increases. Maybe it declines in the early afternoon, but then as folks start heading home in California, turning on their devices, the electrical demand reaches its global maximum, its daily peak, here in the late afternoon, sometime after 8 o'clock. Now, keep this in mind. I'm going to juxtapose that with the day in which maybe you have a cooler morning. So the AC demand, I keep just going back to AC just because it's something that's variable. People use it when they need it, not when they don't, because it's expensive, right? Is lower. So what you see is you actually have lower demand over the course of much of the day, but then maybe you have a hotter evening. And so you see a steeper demand curve here, right? Which means you're going to have to mobilize more resources to go from this low here to get to the next, to the peak, right? So the next appropriate question that hopefully comes to mind and what you're asking, going back to that maxim about good investors, good lenders, good developers, knowing what the right questions are to ask is, well, how do I mobilize resources to meet that instantaneous demand? And the first place to start is always going to be variable operating costs. Now, economic jargon aside, what's the way to best think about that? Think about that as the cost of running the plant at a minimum to cover its cost, right? If you've got a nuclear plant in this made up example, right, and the electricity price is $4 a megawatt hour, you're never going to produce a unit of electricity because you lose $1 for every $1 of electricity you sell. You need a minimum price of $5 just to cover your operating costs, your variable operating costs. Think of those as fuels, consumables, maybe staff time, although that's going to be marginal to turn things on and off. But it's the cost of running and producing the next megawatt hour of energy. Now, nuclear fuel is extremely efficient. It uses nuclear fission. In practice, because fusion reactors don't exist on any meaningful commercial scale, you're breaking nuclei apart, and that's producing a ton of energy for every unit of fuel going in. So it's a really low cost, $5 per megawatt hour, directionally accurate. It may vary from plant to plant, different geographies, depending on the actual price of the fuel, etc. But generally speaking, it might be an order of magnitude lower than natural gas, where the fuel is a much bigger driver of cost, right? The actual plant may be cheaper, a natural gas-fired power plant, but your fuel cost, because the underlying chemical reaction is less efficient than the underlying nuclear reaction in a nuclear plant, is higher, right? To get the same amount of energy, you have to put more figurative fuel in. So typically speaking, and hopefully this makes common sense when you think about it, you're going to run the cheapest plant first until it produces as much as it can. And then and only then are you going to ask the next one to go, right? And we're going to build on that framework a couple of times here to build up towards that location-based marginal pricing that also includes congestion pricing and constraints. But start from this first principle, right? And now we're going to plot it across the entire California grid, across a different chart, in which on the y-axis, once again, we have price, but here it's the variable operating cost. You can simplify that in terms of your own mental framework to the cost of fuel plus associated costs, but fuel cost isn't a bad example. And then on the x-axis, you can see the total demand in gigawatts. We talk about gigawatts of demand on, say, a state or system-wide level. increasingly a lot of data centers are building gigawatts worth of demand, right? But that gigawatt is a meaningful scale for not just like one specific power plant, but a combination of power plants that are servicing something on the order of the size of a state or a very large populous county. So what's going to happen is first you're going to run the cheapest power plants, which happen to be typically your renewables, and by that I mean specifically wind and solar. While I'm exaggerating a little, they operate for free once you build them. The sun, until someone figures out to the contrary, still shines for free. The wind blows for free, and they oftentimes in their underlying agreements with the grid have what's called a must dispatch, must runs agreement with the interconnection authority, the utility. So they get to sell everything they produce, and they go first, right? Now, next in your order of dispatch, your supply stack, your merit order of dispatch, and by merit order, we mean in order of least to most expensive, you're probably going to run your nuclear power plants. They oftentimes, typically alongside renewables, have that must dispatch rule where they get to sell whatever they produce. And that also has to do with the technical reality of nuclear power plants. Not to torture you with too much, but if you turn them off, they're really hard to turn back on in any real amount of time just because of the reality you need to let the reactor cool down and amongst other things. So you really don't want to turn them off, not to mention they are pretty cheap. So they're typically only turned off in emergencies or when they run out of fuel or if the market conditions are so adverse that it's justified to do so. But you really don't want to be turning them off is perhaps the takeaway. So they might, in say the California Independent System Operator territory, come next. Then you might have hydro. I won't dwell too much on hydro, but you might ask, well, hydro is renewable too. Water flows down river streams for free. Why does hydro have a non-zero variable cost? And once again, without boiling the figurative ocean to get to the bottom, the simplest explanation is some of the management of the sluice gates, of the actual, opening the dam, closing the dam, there's cost associated with that. So it varies from one site to the next, as you can see with these specific different assets. But hydro has some non-trivial, but pretty close to zero variable operating costs. Now, that's the world of the sort of must-run dispatch power plants that are typically almost always on, unless if there's some emergency, because California, you're not going to see demand much below this, right? A lot of this is base load. It's going to be able to run all the time. But this is when you start to see your conventional dispatchable fossil fuel power plants coming in next. And the first, in this case, in California, it may be different from one location to the next, is going to be coal. So why this one coal plant is here and the others there may be a nuanced question, but some things to keep in mind and consider and to help build that intuition once again is, these may be newer power plants with better technology that convert more fuel into more energy than these older ones, or these may have higher wear and tear on them than the power plants here in this earlier part, so they're less efficient just because they've been operating for 10, 15 years and, a really massive piece of infrastructure that's operating at really high temperatures becomes less efficient over time as there's literal wear and tear from those high temperature activities. These might be old plants too, but they've recently been refurbished, right? These plants might also be closer to a train track that can buy cheap, coal from Wyoming, whereas these have to buy their coal from West Virginia, which is more expensive or farther away. But the point remains, right? It's some combination of all of the above, and each plant has its own net efficiency factor, which is a function not only of the actual plant's underlying technical efficiency, but also say its access to fuel. And that determines when each plant is dispatched in that merit order of capacity, right? You're going to call this plant first because it can operate the cheapest relative to all the other coal plants, and this one last because you're only going to call on it when you need it. Natural gas is similar. Obviously, you're burning gas as a fuel rather than coal. One distinction, and which we'll get into very briefly here, is natural gas has two configurations, combined cycle and what open or single cycle, depending on whether you're British or American. And combined cycle, the easiest way to think of this, which is once again a bit of an oversimplification, is you run through two cycles of combustion. The first is just the combustion of the natural gas through a gas turbine, and you capture the energy from that by spinning a turbine as the gas is combusted. You convert that rotational energy through a generator into electrical energy. But then that combustion reaction itself on a chemical level is producing really high temperature steam, which you capture in the second cycle, hence the combined cycle, and run through a steam generator to capture that energy of the water vapor, the steam that would otherwise be vented out, right? So it's more expensive than single or open cycle power plants, but the virtue, of course, is you're capturing not just the energy from the combustion, the burning of the gas in the first instance, but the water vapor, the high temperature water that results as well. In some contexts, obviously, you also build those single and open cycles. The biggest difference being, unsurprisingly, that you let that waste energy go. The heat is just vented out of the smokestacks, as the case may be. And so they're less efficient, right? Because they're converting fewer units of that fuel into useful electrical energy. That may be by design, because these plants may not want to run all the time. They may just want to meet extraordinary needs. But what you can see, and we'll have some some oil and other power plants maybe at the top range here, just for peak days when you really need electricity and nothing else is available, is your merit order of dispatch, right? And what we're going to do now that we understand how supply is built up, how we determine who runs and when, right, is juxtapose that with that demand curve, right? We looked at the full day's worth of demand, but as I said, in electricity, demand is instantaneous. If in the morning peak at 9 o'clock, when everyone gets up, they turn on their TVs, they run their electric kettles, you're microwaving something, maybe to heat it up for a pet, as the case may be, you're going to need 93 gigawatts, rain or shine. Even if there are, dispatchable resources like battery storage or pumped hydro, at that instant, you need to deliver the 93 gigawatts, whether it's coming from immediate generation or stored energy, as the case may be, right? And the way to think about it is the marginal plant still setting the price, right? This plant is needed because this plant and every plant to the left of it is going to give you that 93 gigawatt hour. So it needs to run. And to run, it needs to be compensated at a price that at least covers its variable operating costs, pays for its fuel costs so that it's profitable. Otherwise, it's not going to run. It's not going to lose money to serve the grid, right, on every megawatt hour it generates. So it needs to be at least breaking even, or more likely, profitable for each unit of electricity that it generates. Hence, the marginal plant is setting the marginal price, right? Which in this case corresponds to about $50 per megawatt hour. So during this morning peak, every megawatt hour that while the peak stays in this range is being delivered is going to cost about $50 per megawatt hour. And whilst, some of these generators here on the left may have bilateral contracts, let's park that for a second. They're each getting this price too, the $50 per megawatt hour that this plant is setting. Now, imagine we're in the evening peak. We have about 20 more gigawatts of demand. When this was previously the marginal plant, now this has become the marginal plant. So every plant in between has to be run as well to meet that 110 gigawatt of need at that evening time zone, right? And in fact, you could imagine, although it's not shown on this graph, some of this solar may no longer be available. So the line could even be further to the right if some of this comes offline, by way of example. But let's not go there for now. I just wanted to sort of illustrate that the supply stack isn't fixed. It obviously changes if the resource becomes unavailable. Everything moves to the left or right, depending on where that resource in the supply stack and merit order is lost. But now we have to activate all these other power plants. So this power plant, which say has an average price of 75, if we were to go across in a straight-ish line, notwithstanding my shaky fingers, that's the price it needs to meet its variable operating costs and incentivize all these other plants that previously went on to run. So now this entire stack of resources is getting that $75 per megawatt hour price until such time that the demand changes, right? And you can imagine a really hot evening, maybe some of these plants went offline or it's just the hottest day of the year and you've activated the grid to its maximal demand. And now you're even using some of those, as I said, oil power peaker plants that maybe sometimes operate even only for a few hours a whole year. Sometimes there are peaker plants that only operate once every 2-3 years for a couple of hours when the price really skyrockets, because the demand becomes very inelastic as the supply becomes very inelastic as the demand is here too, the further you push up against the grid's constraints and limits, right? What you can see here is now the price required to get that last plant to run is about $175 per megawatt hour. So everyone else has to be compensated at that same level too. So this is how supply and demand come together, right, to set our overall price, this generation marginal cost, and this is the system-wide cost, right? In the real-time, generation need, the demand has to be met with real-time resources. So this is the system-wide cost. If you're looking at New York State, right, or California State, this power plant setting the statewide price at a system level. But now we need to go a layer deeper, which is to figure out how localized effects, transmission congestion costs, are going to modify the actual price specific power plants that get paid, or that specific, ratepayers are in effect paying, obviously averaged over the course of the year. But to do that, we need to take a step back and understand, go deeper into how the transmission system works, which I find fascinating and hopefully you'll find interesting as well. But before we do so, right, so far to lay out the case, we've understood the dispatch curve, right, how the merit order works and which resources are the cheapest to run and the order in which they call them up to meet the demand, which determines how far up the curve we go, and therefore what marginal resource assisting the system-wide price, but predicated on that assumption that we can actually deliver the power where we need to, right? And price formation starts with dispatch, but what we're going to find is geography and physical constraints really matter. So, with apologies, hopefully my accent at this point is still strong enough to betray I'm not an American. I grew up in New Zealand. But with apologies to our international friends, we're going to keep coming back to US examples for obvious reasons. Not that there's anything wrong with the US in turn, with no offense to our US colleagues, but obviously it'd be nice if we could mix up the examples. But let's start with the US grid system, which is actually a rather interesting one, right? So at a 30,000-foot level, the US has three major physical infrastructure zones: the Eastern Interconnection, the Western Interconnection, and they're more or less separated here. I'm, painting with a broad figurative brush, but by the Rocky Mountains, there's a giant physical divide here. Obviously, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but in effect, that does correspond to about where the Rocky Mountains are. And then with apologies to our friends from Texas, I can't help but make this joke. Texas, both figuratively and literally, refuses to join the union. At least in this case, they've seceded from the electric grid, and Texas is its own effective island. The electricity reliability, I forget what the C stands for, of Texas, is their independent system operator. And so each of these are interconnected to one another. Think of them as each having lots of transmission lines connecting the states and regions to one another. And they do interconnect, but with really small and shallow interconnections, as we'll get into shortly, right? So before we get into, the different regions and their transmission constraints, here's also a breakdown of the population density and therefore the demand centers in the US. So hopefully this isn't surprising that it's broken down like this, right? I mean, Texas aside, much of the population in the West Coast is on the coast. Yes, there are meaningful population centers in the middle of the country, but west of the, Rockies is far less populous, say, than much of the East Coast and much of southern and eastern Texas, right? This band here in the middle of the country is less populous, and it happens to correspond, right, to these borders approximately, give or take as well. Also because of the physical barriers, right? A good rule of thumb if you're building transmission lines historically was each mile might cost $1 million in terms of just the cost of building the transmission, the steel, the copper, whatever else that's required to build the big, towers and then build the cables across the top of them. And that can increase to $3 to $12 million if we're talking about, say, mountainous terrain, which is part of the reason why East and West are poorly connected. It's just geography. Geography is destiny. Texas, as I said, is a little different because it's more of a deliberate choice, but no value judgments being passed here. But then let's look at the, actual power lines. And if you want to go a little deeper here, I'd encourage you to look up China. China is very different. They have a much more, centralized state view, and it's much more uniformly laid out with high transmission lines. But the US, both because of geography, which is destiny, and also the distinction between the federal and state governments, has a very different dynamic when transmission is concerned, which is a constraint to the build out, as you can imagine, of new resources going forward. Because it's really difficult to, say, build a power line that connects New York to Pennsylvania because of the cross-border related issues. The Chinese government just takes a more centralized view, and they just build, exercise the equivalent of eminent domain laws, and they build power lines to connect the demand centers to the supply resources. So in terms of the really high voltage power lines, there's some here in the sort of Midwest connecting to the East Coast, one large power line connecting New York to Canada, but not too much connectivity, right? If we go a layer deeper to 500 kilovolt lines, you can see there's a lot in the Eastern corridor, a lot in the Western interconnection zone, but they don't connect, right? There are no really high voltage power lines connecting east to west. If we go a layer deeper, we suddenly see much more connectivity. But still, keep your eye, say on the east to west connection, there's one power line here connecting the two, right? And a way to maybe envision that electricity being less intuitive, obviously, than water, as I alluded to earlier, is imagine these are massive water, pipelines or gas pipelines carrying physical stuff, right? There's one interconnection here. So if this is, 100 gigawatts, 200 gigawatts worth of electric capacity, if the interconnection is 2 gigawatts, right, you can only import or export 2% of that capacity in either direction, right? So it's a giant constraint. And the same is true here in Texas. Don't be fooled by the what looks like a lot of connectivity. These are really small power lines, and the interconnections from one to the other are going to be really trivial and small, right? So if you've ever wondered, right, and people used to talk about let's build a bunch of solar in the Sahara to power the world. If you build, this much solar in just one tiny portion of the Sahara that's uninhabited, you could power the whole world. Technically true, but how do you deliver that power anywhere else in the world, right? And the same is true here. You may have wondered, why can't we power New York City and Chicago by building a lot of solar in, say, the Mojave Desert in California? Well, it has to do with this constraint. It would require high voltage transmission, and the three interconnection zones function almost independently. What do I mean when I say that? I mean, even if you added all the smaller lines that interconnect the two of them, right? There's not a lot of transmission connecting east to west and east and west to Texas either. There are 6 DC ties, direct current, and some AC ties that connect east to west, and then only two that connect the east to ERCOT. ERCOT is the Texas region, and to contextualize that, right? My information may be a little old, but this is directionally accurate. The total Texas system is on the order of 50 gigawatts. Those interconnects are on the order of 2 gigawatts, right? Tops, maybe 1 to 2. So it's between 2 to 4%, which is why, unfortunately, too, when you see issues where, say, Texas has really bad storms and the electric power grid is affected, or there are times when there's enormously cheap electricity in West Texas because it's really windy, the prices even dip negative, and you would love to be able to export that power to other locations to, generate profit rather than lose money in the system. But because you can only export between 2 to 4% of your power, or import by that same token 2 to 4% of your power, each of these zones is independent, right? It's as if from an electricity perspective, the United States is 3 separate countries: the West Coast, the Texas region, and the East Coast, right? So at a 30,000-foot level, that's restricting the resources that we can channel from one place to the next. And that gets pronounced and exacerbated when we go down to the state or even county level. Before we move on, though, just a couple of points to help further contextualize that. The US has over 7,000 power plants, 160,000 miles of high voltage power lines, and millions of lower voltage power lines and distribution transformers. And the total customer base, if we count all residential, commercial, and industrial customers, is in excess of 145 minutes. But because electricity supply can't be, matched in real time, we have these balancing authorities, the independent system operators I keep talking about, and there are approximately 60 of them in the US, which may be utilities or larger, independent system operators that actually manage the interaction between multiple utilities in one area. So what does that look like on the map of the North America, or at least much of Canada and the US? You might see the California Independent System Operator, which I've spoken or alluded to a couple of times. You have ERCOT, you have Alberta's electrical system, the PJM interconnection, which is the largest, or historically was the largest in the world. There may be a Chinese zone that's now larger. New York ISO New England, and so on, right? And these entities are an overarching, often not-for-profit, that manages the rules set by the regulators that set those, create the power markets that then determine where power is needed, when it's needed, other services, ancillary services the grid needs, and so on, right? So they're the interfacing entity that allows generators in, say, New York State who want to sell to PJM and also to New England, depending on what's the most profitable, the best outcome for them, to interface correctly together. And also for utilities, who have their own distinct service territories, to communicate figuratively or literally with one another as well. So they are the principal body that's now managing these markets that are going to help solve some of these issues. And in the US, about 60% of power supplied to all utilities is managed by one of these regional transmission operators. You can see the American South here is separate. They chose not to disaggregate generation from transmission and distribution, so they don't have these because, say, in Georgia, Georgia Southern provides not only generation, but transmission and distribution for much of the state. So it's an integrated utility system, and you don't have the same interface issues because the utilities are managing the entire service territory, and there are fewer agents, actors, counterparts who require that regulatory oversight or support, as the case may be. So boiling it down to the resource level question, right? Wind and solar, say, I'm going to keep that coming back to the familiar New York example just because it's easier for me, may be strongest in terms of their potential far away from a load center. So upstate New York can be really windy, can be sunny in places, right? But as I said, 8 million people live in New York City, but there are only so many lines that go through to New York. And just in the same way that a water pipe can only take as much water as fits in the pipe, so too can transmission overhead lines only carry as much electricity as the line permits without doing damage to the grid or resulting in blackouts and brownouts. So what's really important is that the local prices take into account congestion so that then power is routed optimally from A to B to C or A to C to D, as the case may be, in a way that makes the most sense, right? So when we typically think about location as investors, as lenders, and especially as developers, it's a siting question. Where should we be building power lines such that we or power plants, as the case may be, get the best possible result? Is it close to the grid so we can interconnect easily? Is it close to a grid site that doesn't require a lot of upgrades so that we don't have to pay for that cost? The resource is good. Maybe is it close to a gas pipeline or renewable natural gas feedstock? But it also becomes a revenue and cost question on the flip side, depending on whether we enter into an offtake agreement where we have a contracted set of revenues, or if we're going to participate as a participant in the market, say as battery storage or natural gas-fired assets sometimes do, in such a way as to maximize our revenue. So location becomes not just the siting question, but a revenue and cost question in turn. So we, in the prior section, talked about generation marginal cost. Now we're going to talk about transmission congestion cost, the second sort of leg of this three-legged stool. As I said, cost of marginal losses is a bit ancillary to this discussion. But to do that, right, we're going to go through another example, and I apologize because I'm going to ask you to bear with me as I continue to repeat the same sort of set of rules around supply needs to meet demand and push us towards that constraint until we can see how congestion factors in. So imagine as an example, we have 3 power plants, generator 1, 2, and 3, each with different prices, $25, $30, and $50 a megawatt hour, that can each generate up to 100 megawatts of capacity at an instant in time. And Node B is our center. It's a city. Maybe it's first thing in the morning. And right now they need 100 megawatts of power. And the value of the power is going to change by location. So if all we need is 100 megawatt hours, right, then we can use just generator 1 to supply all the power. So our active price, no constraints applied, is going to be the $25 per megawatt hour associated with this plant, which over an hour and 100 megawatts is going to correspond to $2,500 of cost. Now let's increase that by just 1 so that this plant's no longer sufficient to provide all the load, and this will hammer home that supply stack merit order point. Let's say we need just 1 more megawatt, right? We've gone from 100 now to 101. Suddenly we need this plant to run. And if it's running for 1 megawatt, right, which sounds ridiculous, but technically this is true, how it would work. Practically you might have multiple power plants, so it's not like they would just generate the 1 megawatt. But let's say they need $30 per megawatt hour for that extra megawatt required to be delivered to the load center. Maybe I turned on my all my electric devices at home, even those wouldn't add up to a megawatt, but let's argue that I did. And suddenly everyone's got to pay for the full 101 megawatt hours, the $30 per megawatt hour marginal price of this plant B, or generator B, right? So now it's 101 times 30 megawatt hours times an hour, let's say. That's going to translate to $3,030 suddenly. And so on. Let's add 100 megawatts to the demand so that we have to trip now generator 3 as well. And the same remains true. Now we need an average price of $50 per megawatt hour, even though this plant's only generating the 1 megawatt hour. So our full 201 megawatt hours are being compensated at that 50 price, or $10,050. So far, we're still in this world of the system cost is determined by supply and demand, but we're going to start factoring in congestion. Before we do that, 3 quick important concepts to recall. The location-based price is usually, but not always, equal to that next megawatt of price, right? Assuming there are no constraints. when the system is unconstrained, which is 0.2. But under constraint, let's say there's not enough power to send, or not enough, the transmission line's insufficient to send power from A to B, then we might see a higher price than what any one generator by itself may suggest. So imagine a hypothetical setup where you have generator A connected to load center C, and A can provide 15 megawatts to meet the load at C. If there's a straight line between the two, then it follows pretty logically, right? As if it were a water pipeline. You can send all the power from A to C, right? The 15 megawatts, no issue, right? Even if there were, so long as obviously it can take all 15 megawatts, it's like a water pipeline that can take as much water as needed. The reality, however, is our electric grid is a generator, maybe not directly, it may be interconnected through a substation, but to a variety of different nodes and connection points, right? So imagine now you have generator A connected to load C through both the direct A to C connection, but also through a B to C connection. Now, without torturing you with Maxwell's equations or any electrical engineering, our power lines, right, well, they don't have equal impedance, but they have this property, which is called impedance, that informs how much electricity goes on in one line versus the next, right? And the water's, just as water follows the path of least resistance, whether that's gravity or through application of pressure with compressors and other devices in our our water utility system, so too does electricity follow the path of least resistance. And so if you have two lines of all these lines of equal impedance, and you have two pathways, and you're trying to say distribute this 15 megawatts, 2/3 of the power is going to follow the lowest path of resistance here, the direct line, and because the impedance is double, 1/3 is going to go into the other direction. We won't have the time to break down why that's the case. In this day and age of AI, I think you could Google how impedance works, or use Claude or ChatGPT of your choice to answer that question. But for now, take me at my word that assuming we have equal impedance and I'm generating 15 megawatt hours, and there's these three lines, A to B to C, B to C, and then A to C, then 2/3 is going to go the long way because it's twice as long, and 1/3 is going to go the shorter way, right? So double the impedance means half the power. So 10 megawatts is going to go directly from A to C to meet the 15 of load, and then 5 is going to go the long way around first to B and then to C. That's going to have the lowest also like resistance, which is why electrical power naturally follows this route, assuming these set of assumptions, right? So now if we swap node B and assume it's a different generator and we still need 15 megawatts of load, then we're going to run plant A and provide all that load. 10 is going to go the short way, 5 is going to go the long way around. So our average price is $20 per megawatt hour, which is what generator A produces. And we can meet all our need directly. Now, I'm going to continually build this up from 15 now to 18, and then to 30 and to 31 to show you how they interface and interact with one another. This is a simplified example, but a really good way to understand how congestion pricing is determined. Now imagine we need 21 megawatts of load. Generator A can only provide 18. So first, we think about the impedance. 12 megawatts, 2/3 is going to go the short way, assuming there's no constraint, and 6 megawatts is going to go the long way. So generator A can provide 18 megawatts. We have a shortfall of 3. 3 is going to have to be provided by generator B. 1/3 is going to go the long way, and 2/3 is going to go the short way. The same is true for generator B in terms of the impedance rules and the underlying electrical reality. And so you're getting 2 that goes this way, 1 that goes that way, and the net result is you're delivering 8 megawatts from the B to C line through both generators A and B, and 13 megawatts through the A to C line through both generators A and B to give that total 18 megawatts of load. And you might ask, what's the price? Well, it's the price of the next marginal plant, which in this case is generator B. Hopefully that makes sense. We're going to keep pushing up that amount. Now let's assume generator A here, just the A to C line, has a 15 megawatt limit. That's the maximum you can send. There just aren't more cables, and you'd overheat the line if you tried to send more. So we've instituted now a constraint, and the load's now going to be increased to 30. And we're going to figure out how, through clever reorganization, we get to that 30 without tripping this value. Well, actually, we might trip it in the first instance and then figure out how we work around it. So A can no longer meet all the supply, right? It can only provide 18. And if it sends 12 this way and 6 that way, you'd think there's no problem. But if B needs to also send 12, right, to 12 plus 18 being 30, and 2/3 goes the short way, and a third or 4 megawatts goes the long way, 4 plus 16 is 15. So you can't do it this way, right? Generator A can't provide 18, generator B can't provide 12. So you're going to have to rework the situation, right? Which means you may have to generate more at B and reduce A's output to 15 such that you get a split of 15-15, right? Such that A continues to send 10 the short way, 5 the long way, and vice versa for B, such that you're only sending 15 from A to C, and net you're only sending 15 from B to C. Here we've worked around the constraint, right? Because we can do so in such a way that we haven't exceeded the 30 gigawatt limit and tripped the line, as the case may be. But now imagine we need an extra megawatt of load. Suddenly we need 31, right? And don't mind the text on the screen because I'll come back to how it's done. If the load now increases by 1 megawatt, then there's no way A can provide enough power without tripping this load. You'll see why. It needs to provide 14, so it sends 9.33 one way, the short way, and it sends a third or 4.67 the other way. And B must offset the one that A can't send this way by producing an extra 2. One to meet the extra demand to go from 30 to 31, and then one to offset the generation that A is no longer producing. But what that practically now means, right, is you can make the maths work. You've got 17 plus 14 equals 31. A is sending, as I said, 2/3, 9.33 one way, which plus the 5.67 that B is sending the other way translates to 15 megawatts. You haven't exceeded the limit. And you've got 17, on this side, you've got 16 megawatts, 11.33 from plus 4.67 going. But what B had to do was produce an extra 2, one to meet the extra megawatt of load required, and one to offset what we're having to reduce A's generation by. So the location-based marginal price factoring in congestion is the cost of paying for those extra 2 megawatt hours. 2 times 30 is $60 per megawatt hour, minus the one that we're avoiding from A, or $40 per megawatt hour. So despite the fact that this generator has a bid price of 30 and this one has 20, the net price that everyone's paying is that difference to cover the congestion cost of 40. So suddenly our active price is higher than the bid price for both power plants because of the interface and interaction that's created by congestion. So when we factor in, when we think about location-based marginal price, right, it's not just a matter of the system cost that determines what these, generators are bidding relative to the supply required, but also the transmission constraints. And in the subsequent session, we'll get into other sort of constraints, although not nearly to this degree of detail, right, that ultimately inform the net price that people are going to pay, which when it is a constraint system, right, you have to factor in these congestion transmission constraints to get to the net actual price and figure out what people are paying, which in this case is your $40 per megawatt hour. So I appreciate your patience. We've gotten to the end of the presentation part, 2 minutes over, but that gives us plenty of time for Q&A, which feels nice. But what have we learned, right? Demand sets the need, how much power the grid must instantaneously serve. With dispatch, we figure out what gets dispatched in terms of the resources to meet that need. And transmission is going to change shape deliverability to the extent there's congestion, which is going to make sure that scarce power can be delivered where it needs to be, notwithstanding those constraints. And ultimately, what that then means is markets end up being the places where we take those physical constraints and convert them into the financial signals that in the next and subsequent session we're going to use as a way of thinking about how then to make smart investment or lending decisions by factoring in how these physical constraints ultimately inform the kind of revenue contracts and constructs we need to make a bankable, viable investment. Power prices accordingly reflect not just demand and supply, but deliverability and location and a couple of other factors, which we'll get into in the next session. So I'll finish there with a little bit of a plug, but not oversell you on the products and services we can provide. And then I'll go into some of the Q&A questions here shortly, voice those over. And after I talk through some of the ones that are written up here, we can also feel free to come off mute and ask me questions. But if you want to learn more about power markets and how they're applied, say, in specific asset classes, our battery storage course goes much deeper on some of these concepts and talks through how batteries in particular that are dispatching in real time make money and avoid losing money, which is just as important when they're interconnected to the grid, whether on a standalone basis or if co-located with battery storage, whether as a merchant power plant that solely sells electricity at market prices or with a partial, contracted versus uncontracted strategy, and so on. And we go very deep into the, fundamentals of battery storage on a technical cost and other perspective from other perspectives as the case may be. We also have less related critical minerals and data center courses if you want to get deeper on how those asset classes are financed and the best practices and approaches not only on the modeling but the deal structuring side of things. The second bucket here are our financial securities oriented courses. We have a modeling fundamentals course that's, as the name suggests, financial modeling and structuring 101. Then we have a highly specialized tax equity and advanced project finance debt courses. The latter is great if you want to understand how these projects are actually financed, specific structures that match the underlying characteristics of energy assets that are dispatching into the grid. And we also have our introductory project finance, renewable energy, and infrastructure courses that touch on these topics, but are more foundational in developing skills that are necessary to succeed in this space. So with that, I'll stop. I'll try to go through quickly the questions in the Q&A, and I'll take the easier ones first and work our way up, and then welcome folks coming off for the next 25 minutes to ask any tough questions. But please be kind. I know some stuff about the markets, but I'm by no means an oracle here. So one of the questions is, what is the difference between the balancing authorities and the 10 RTOs? There really isn't. It's just a different nomenclature used for the same thing. But you could think of there are balancing authorities that aren't RTOs. All RTOs manage balancing, but you may have more regionalized balancing authorities in some context as well. That's probably the best way to think about it. But one of the functions of the regional transmission organizations is to manage the balancing services. Now, a second question is, will a recording of the webinars be available? Yes, recording will be made available at some point in the future, and I will work with the team to make that accessible. Another easy question. Now, an excellent question is, how quickly can each additional plant be turned online if demand increases and our marginal plants are able to immediately meet this demand? The answer is yes and no. Some plants can be turned online almost instantaneously, and that might be why they exist. Like peaker plants, like I said, in some cases only operate a few hours a year, and the service they're providing is exactly that. They can turn on instantly. Battery storage can do that in some cases. Some natural gas-fired assets can. Large hydro pump storage assets can, open the sluice gates and let water tumble down the dam and provide near instantaneous electricity. But obviously, other asset classes, natural, nuclear, wind, and solar, geothermal are going to be much more limited in their ability to dispatch. So it depends, right? And even within an asset class, right, like a natural gas-fired power plant can typically be turned on pretty quickly, even if it's a combined cycle plant. You don't really want to go through the wear and tear and the damage of turning something on for an hour, because you might need to then let it cool off for half an hour as the case may be. So that's a really long-winded way of saying there are assets that can be turned on instantaneously or near instantaneously and those that can't. And when we get into ancillary services in the subsequent webinar, you might start to develop the intuition around, one, what those resources look like, and then how they're compensated differently precisely for the services that they're offering. All right. Another question, given all the challenges, and I apologize for reading this out, but just so you know what I'm talking about, facing the grid today, where do you see microgrids fitting in? What problem are they actually best suited to solve? So that onion is tough to peel. I'll try to give you a good answer, but it's not going to be comprehensive. There's obviously the need for standalone microgrids where it just doesn't make sense to extend access to the grid. And to use a maybe crude analogy, but a useful one, one of the great success stories of the last 50 years is that the African subcontinent just leapfrogged straight from, old-fashioned landline phones to cell phones, right? And the same may be true here in places where it maybe doesn't make sense or it is super expensive to build out the old-fashioned centralized grid that Thomas Edison and co-pioneered. Maybe a microgrid is a better solution, right? Like in a city that maybe is really populous and dense, or in a country, maybe you have one large electricity center and the rest is rural, and it doesn't make sense to build a giant hub and then lots of expensive spokes to serve a couple of hundred people here or there, when, as I said, a power line might cost between $1 million to $12 million a mile. Maybe a microgrid fits that situation pretty well. Now, I think your question is more, how do we also interface microgrids with the existing grid? And there are lots of challenges. And I guess the question is, what problem ultimately is it solving? I had a professor once who is a Nobel Prize winner. He was a part of the IPCC group that was awarded the Nobel Prize in the aughts. And he always said, whenever we think about energy services, what's really important is to understand and recall that what is the underlying energy service being delivered? And so is the microgrid providing a service that the grid itself can't, right? Now that might be reliability. What you might see is let's just use data centers as an example. If they need reliability, they cannot go down. Maybe they want a little microgrid as a backup to the grid so that if the grid goes down for whatever reason, they have backup resources to meet the needs so that the data center can continue operating, right? Hospitals, universities often have effectively microgrids. I mean, they may have small power plants on site, but as microgrid technologies, combinations of, on site, say solar and storage, et cetera, grow, you might see a proliferation of those solutions where the energy service being rendered is ultimately reliability. So the question is, what problem are you solving for? If it's reliability, there's a role for, I think, microgrids across the board. If it's price, then it becomes a case-by-case question of whether the grid is cheaper or the microgrid, and so on, right? I would say the problems that they're best suited to solve depend on the case-by-case set of circumstances, but the two things that microgrids and broad strokes can solve for are, one, in some cases, lower price, and then secondarily, reliability. All right. Looks like there are a couple of questions in the chat, but I might encourage if anyone wants to come offline, just so I can figure out I'm not talking to myself. If anyone wants to come off mute and pose a question, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, I'll wait for the questions in the Q&A. Another easy one, whilst someone becomes brave enough to come off mute, is when is part 2 of this webinar? It'll likely be in the first or second week of September. We're still finalizing the dates, as the case may be. Okay, just looking at the chat, and I apologize, I'm gonna for the generator side, they're also used as a hedge factor. Can you talk about this? Also for gas-powered power plants, spark spread dictates the power price. I'm not going to go too into the weeds, but you are right. So the spark spread, and you also have the black spread. So black spread's for coal, the spark spread's often used for gas. Those are industry metrics terms that are used to describe the effective profitability, say, of a natural gas power plant. It's the spread between the cost of the fuel, right, and the market price effectively for that specific power plant, given its efficiency, right, that allows you to determine whether it's going to dispatch or not, all right? It's basically a gas level summary of that same supply and demand analysis we went through, converted into a, well understood usable metric that people can figure out whether the spark spread is favorable and therefore you dispatch or not, both over a short time period or over long time periods. I'm not going to get into hedges just because that would require a great deal more time. So I'm going to go across to other conversations. Basis risk. Can you talk about from the generator side how does shape factor in? Does every generator have to come with location and provide to the hub, or does the ISO come with their LMP hub? I'm not entirely sure what the question is, but I think the way I would interpret it is it depends, right? Some, as you saw with the congestion charges, right? It'll be the sum total of the resources available, the demand, and those constraints imposed. Now that's just 3 levels of constraint, right? Supply, demand, and congestion. Imagine on top of that, you've also got to layer on things like voltage needs to be at a certain level. You need to maintain frequency within a certain context and have a certain degree of backup and so on and so forth, right? So each of these markets, depending on the rules they've set and the physical constraints they have, is kind of solving this mathematical optimization problem where they set all the constraints and try to figure out what's the best mix of resources to, at the lowest price possible, deliver that service. So shape is factoring in by, as a function of that as well, in the sense that you've got to factor on all these different constraints and then back solve for what's the best sort of optimal setup to deliver the power in the way that you need it. Working my way up. Oh, looks like we have 2 other questions in the Q&A chat. Where does BESS fit into the merit order? Does it always just follow the marginal price? That is an excellent question. So it depends, right? It's hard to answer in the sense that, let's talk about it in broad strokes, right? A battery, let's say a battery storage unit operating at peak efficiency, it might buy power from the grid, let's say 100 megawatt hours worth to charge itself, right? Now, it might buy that power at, I don't know, just use round numbers, $10 per megawatt hour, right? But battery storage systems, to make a really bad joke, but an honest joke, right? The rules of thermodynamics, if you've ever studied physics, some smart aleck professors will summarize as the first rule is you can't win. The second rule is you can't break even. And the third rule is you're going to lose. And that's a long-winded way of saying of that 100 megawatt hours we purchased, about 20 megawatt hours is going to be lost in just round trip inefficiencies. So you can only sell 80 megawatt hours to the grid, right? To answer your question, Jonathan. So where best fits in the merit order kind of depends on the price at which they charged. So if they charged at $10 per megawatt hour, just to break even, you can imagine in the example I gave you, since they can only sell 80 back to the grid, they need to at least make $12.50 per megawatt hour to break even because they've lost 20% of their, generation just because of the underlying physics. So 10 divided by 0.8 to get you the price, you need $12.50 to break even. So that's a really long-winded way of saying it depends on the price at which they, charge the batteries and then choose to dispatch into the grid. So it does always follow marginal price, but as a function of those deviations in timing as well around when they charge, when they choose to dispatch, and so on. I hope that answers your question. All right. Take a few more if you can. Ideally, put it in the Q&A. It's easier to see for me there. Also, welcome folks coming off chat if you're so inclined. So there's a question on the about real-time market versus the day-ahead market. We'll try to get into this next in the next session, but without going too much into the details, the day-ahead market, think of it as the marketplace where suppliers and of the power and those who and the RTO, the Regional Transmission Authority, make their best guess at what they think next day power requirements are going to be, and they enter into a day-ahead agreement where I'm going to require you to deliver X amount of power at a price of Y. So that's going to cover about 95% of the load. And then, the reality is we can't predict the weather the next day, the electricity demand, if a plant's going to go offline. So the real times market's doing is it's going the last 5% or the last 2%, depending on the day and the case by case, to make sure that the real time supply and demand also meet. So the day ahead markets, think of it like a planning market where you plan ahead and get most of the supply and demand met, and then you meet the real-time need depending on variances using the real-time market. That's a bit of a gross oversimplification because the rules are different from one transmission site to the or territory to the next. But say in New York ISO or California ISO, it roughly follows that. Another question here in the Q&A. Do power providers compete to be in certain positions in the queue if they identify revenue maximizing scenarios based on different pricing plant uptime? They effectively compete, right? Let's say you're a natural gas powered fire plant owner, to just give you an example. Obviously, you're competing in real time. You're, depending on what the price is, you're deciding whether to bid or not, assuming you haven't contracted your volume to sell to some other entity on some predetermined basis. But let's say I own a natural gas power plant. It's been operating for 10 years, right? And there's been a lot of wear and tear on it. I also might make the long-term decision of, well, do I do refurbishments to improve its efficiency so that I can compete more, competitively on a go-forward basis so that I can, say, take more fuel and get more electricity out of it and bring my low operating cost down, right? So there's both the dynamic real-time question of how do I, they're not trying to there's nothing to be gained from trying to, said it differently, it's hard to jump the queue and get better and more efficient than someone. In some instances, maybe there's ways to do so. But usually you're just taking the net market result rather than competing with the next generator because that's really hard to do. But over the long term, you do think about that, right? Like a good, thoughtful investor, especially if you're thinking about building a new plant or refurbishing an existing plant, you want to have a view on not just short-term supply and demand, but also longer-term supply and demand dynamics and how that's going to inform what decisions you make about how you operate your plant, how you choose to refurbish it or not, as the case may be, whether you replace it, whether you modify it, and so on and so forth. So power providers are both thinking about the near term, especially batteries, say in natural gas power plants. How do I manage the next day or week? And what do I need to do to optimize revenue and minimize costs? But they're also making these longer term decisions about how's the competitive landscape changing over time. Great question. And another question here says in the chat, can you tell us more about what determines the capacity of a transmission line? Also would love to unmute, but no one can because of how the call is configured. Well, I apologize for that technical constraint. The transmission line capacity is ultimately determined, the biggest constraint is going to be how much cabling and wiring there is, and how much electricity that can carry. If you've ever seen an old-fashioned light bulb, and you've got like one of those dials where you can turn it up or down, you know how it gets hotter, right? That's a perfect example of what a power line's doing, right? That tungsten filament, which is less efficient than copper, right? The more energy that goes through it, the more of that energy is wasted as heat and light. So as you turn up the dial on your volume, right, more energy is going through, and because the resistance is high in the tungsten filament, more of it's being converted into heat, which is why those old-fashioned bulbs can burn you if you touch them, and light, and obviously that's why you can burn it out too, because if you make it too hot, eventually the filament burns out, right? And some of that's planned obsolescence. The GE, Philips, and others of the world build light bulbs deliberately to fail after certain many hours so that they could sell more light bulbs. I'll get off my pedestal about planned obsolescence. But the same is true of the grid, right? Like your cables, your overhead copper lines, and we usually in the US and much of the rest of the world have three-pronged power, can only take so much electricity before you start, overheating practically. But it's more nuanced than that. The power lines, which is why I keep coming back to this water analogy, there's only so much capacity you can really go through. You can, in theory, exceed it for short periods of time, etc., but that can damage the wiring. It can, create other issues in the grid in terms of the reliability and quality of the power, as I alluded to. And so it becomes really important then, right, to make sure that we're managing the grid in such a way that transmission is being delivered from A to B to C in the most efficient way possible. All right. Any other questions here in the chat? And I apologize. I know there's some repeat questions, but I'm trying to make sure I answer questions across the board from a variety of different people. I'm not too familiar with what the latest with FERC, but FERC is the sort of the federal entity that manages national level rules in terms of how all these regional different operators, utilities, etc., interact and reconciles, long story short, the federal rules with the state rules, or rather sets the federal rules to help figure out cross-border, cross-jurisdiction issues, because in the US, for the most part, a lot of the management and rights to manage the electric grid are state level decisions. I'm not a lawyer by training. I only play one on Zoom. But that's the simplest way to think about the role that FERC plays. All right, we probably have the opportunity for one more question if someone wants to put it in the Q&A, and then I might give everyone 5 minutes back here. All right, I'm going to take the absence of a question as an example of silence is gold and silver is speaking as silver, which is an old Russian adage. But thank you everyone for joining. Hopefully this was informative. Would love for you to join us for the next session in September when we'll go a little deeper on these topics. And as I said, please check out some of our courses. We'd love to have you join us and learn more at some point, whether that's on a bespoke basis or you want to take our courses as they're currently configured online at a self-paced basis, as a part of a live session taught by our instructors, and so on and so forth. So please don't be bashful to reach out, and wishing everyone a lovely day wherever you may be, whenever it may be. Thank you now, and take care. Bye.